Welcome back to History 101. My name is Christina Paris. I'm your instructor for this course. And this is part 3 of chapter 15, A Reconstructed Nation, 1865 to 1877. And we are going to be hopefully concluding this chapter. We only have a couple more sections on this chapter, so we should be completing it with this third part. We're going to pick up with a reconstructed West in this section, and we open it up by talking about the Overland Trail, which is really quite an interesting section to open up this part with. And the reason is there is a lot to talk about with the Overland Trail. A lot of us probably don't give a great deal of thought to this, but most migrants that moved along the Overland Trails were actually middle class families. We probably think, and we probably go, well, they were immigrants. They were, people that were out seeking a better life, and that's not actually true. They were seeking a new life, but they actually had middle class. They were middle class families. They had money. They had a fairly good lifestyle. And the reason was it was an expensive endeavor to travel across the country by wagon train or by individual wagon. These wagon outriggings were not a cheap thing to do. You did not take, there were different types of wagons back in the day. We often think automatically, oh, there was just like one type of wagon. There weren't. There was the Surrey, which many of you may have seen before. Usually had a fancy canopy type thing over the very simple carriage structure, had seats in it, maybe one or two rows, and then a little section in the back. Sometimes it was covered where you could put like a picnic basket or something like that in. Usually those type of things were used for around town type thing. You travel maybe a short distance out into the countryside, not very far. Those were light duty conveyances. Then you had your buckboard, which was a little longer distances type thing. You 2 day excursions, not much longer distances. A buckboard was a very rudimentary wagon, usually pulled by a horse, maybe two, maybe a mule type thing, a type animal, but nothing very not a heavy duty type movement or conveyance matter of travel was carried on with a buckboard. You might take some small freight items, something like that, but not long distance travel was done with a buckboard as a general rule, unless you were taking one or two people somewhere. If you were really making a long distance trek anywhere, you generally took something like a Conestoga wagon, a covered wagon. These wagons were much heavier, larger wagons. They were built much more sturdy. They had sturdier wheels on them. The wheels were larger. They were intended to go over rougher terrain. They were meant to hold up. You didn't want your wagon to break down. It's the same thing like with a car. Do you take your little tiny, mini sedan out into rough country? Obviously not, unless you want to get stuck. You generally will have a pickup truck or an SUV that has four-wheel drive to go into rough country. It's the same kind of thing with a Conestoga wagon. You would take that to go across country because you know you're going to go over trails, but there's going to be sections of the trail that are going to not be as well rutted and that are going to have to cross into that country. The Conestoga wagons were, because they were a heavier wagon, they're also covered because you're going to be out on a trail where there's not going to always be coverage. You're going to be crossing over plains. You're going to be crossing sometimes sections of desert. So you're going to have it covered with ribbing, wooden ribbing usually, and this heavy duty duck cloth. And duck cloth is essentially a heavy duty canvas that's coated with a paraffin wax to make it water resistant. This actually will do well in obviously adverse conditions. It's very heavy duty. It endures the weather's adverse conditions of climate, snow, sleet, rain, whatever you're going to encounter on your cross-country traveling, whatever you encounter. Also, you're going to have a basic braking system, and you're probably thinking braking. They had braking on wagons. Yes, they did. They had a very rudimentary braking system because you're going to be going up and down grades in the roads. It's not all flat land that you're going to be crossing. And you are going to come to places in the road where you're going to be going up and down grades. And if you get the wagon pressing against your stock animals that are pulling your wagon, it can cause them to panic. And if the animals start to panic, they can start running faster. And as they run faster, they start pulling against the wagon. Obviously, they start pulling the wagon faster. The wagon presses more against them, and it starts to become a situation where you get a runaway wagon. And if they run fast enough, they can actually cause the harness to break away from the wagon, and then you get a situation where you have a loose wagon. And that's how you get terrible wagon accidents. People were killed in these kind of wagon accidents, runaway wagon accidents. So braking systems become very critical when you're traveling up and down inclines, especially coming down inclines, because these wagons obviously had weight behind them, loaded down with your supplies, loaded down with sometimes with your family. It did add weight against them. So it was important to keep your your foot on your brake, just like you would with a car. Just very different reason. You're obviously, your car is not being pulled by a stock animal. So anyway, keeping this in mind, the stock animals that were pulling these wagons often were anywhere from a larger breed of horse, not obviously the type of horse that you would generally ride, like a palomino, something like that. We're talking a larger breed of horse, something along the lines of a, not quite the size of a Clydesdale, but a larger horse along that line, or an ox pulling these wagons. These wagons were heavy. They had girth behind them as a general rule. You have to figure that these wagons were provisioned out for some number of days, anywhere from 5 to 7 days. You had to plan out these trips across country very carefully. You had to plan how long you had between your forts along your trail. And you had to stick to your trails. That was another key thing. If you've heard of the famous Donner Party excursion, the reason the Donners got in so much trouble was the fact that they deviated off on a unproven shortcut. And it wasn't so much their decision as they followed a guide who promised them that if they took this shortcut, they could make it through the Sierra Nevadas quicker and safer. Turned out that neither was true, and they wound up in a far worse situation than if they had taken the traditional route, the traditional trails, and stuck to the traditional trails. They took a shortcut, and it cost them, a number of them, their lives. Not all of them, but a number of them their lives. You had to take into consideration how many mountain ranges you would be crossing. You had to time, obviously, your trip very carefully, that you would make it across mountain ranges at the right time of year, that you left at the right time of year, that you made it to forts. If you got delayed because of illness, because of bad conditions along the route, because wagon breaking down, you had to make sure that you could make it to a fort where you could stay until winter passed, or until bad conditions passed, so that you could proceed on safely. Otherwise, if you got stuck out on the trail in dire conditions, you could put your whole, either your wagon alone or your entire wagon train, in very grave danger. So it was critical to plan out the trek that you were making very carefully. And I don't know if any of you have ever played the game, The Oregon Trail, but it was a popular game that actually started out as a computer game when I was a kid in school, and we actually had the experience of learning about the actual pioneer experience through this game. And I have to say, it's a dark game. They actually have revived it on the internet. If you ever, and I can actually put the link up for any of you that want to play it, to see if you can actually survive longer than I ever did, because I never made it to the end of the journey. I usually wound up contracting some horrible illness along the way, usually smallpox or dysentery, and dying. I was terrible at hunting. I was terrible at planning out my provisions, or some unusual set of circumstances. The rabbit hunting never went well for me, and I always died in the game. So yeah, it's a fun game that teaches you about all the challenges that you encounter as a settler going across country, and at the same time you're enjoying the experience, but also getting a taste of the unexpected horrors that truly did exist along the way for someone traveling across country. So anyway, that gets you a taste of what migrants faced going across the country, and also tells you about the government forts and what they were there for. They were there to provision you, essentially to provide you with the provisions you needed, and to protect you from the conditions, and also from Native American attacks and from robbers. Obviously, being middle class, you had money on you. You had valuables on you. You were a prime target to be robbed. You were a prime target also. You have to realize that at this point in time, Native Americans were now retaliating. Up until this point in time in U.S. history, Native Americans had been agreeable to being further and further pushed west by the federal government. But just prior to this era, the Native Americans finally had decided enough was enough. And they had finally begun to push back against this being forced off their land. And the violent clashes that began to happen between settlers and native peoples, and the native peoples and the federal government, had become quite disturbing. And we'll talk more about this as we discuss the relations between Native Americans and white settlers. But some of the most common strategies that were employed by Native Americans in retaliation, such as scalping. And you may have heard of scalping. You may have even read descriptions of scalping. It's essentially where a person's scalp, they're actually cut down almost the person's scalp right here. They're usually cut, they would cut the scalp off around the ears and down around the nape of the neck. Would take the scalp clean off with the hair and everything. Some people would actually survive, some wouldn't, depending on how many blood vessels were, and how deeply the skin was penetrated, how many layers of the skin were taken in the scalping, how many nerves were impacted. There's a lot of major nerves that go through the scalp, how much of the nervous system is put into shock, and how deeply affected the nervous system is by the trauma. Some people would survive the scalping, and the physical appearance of someone having survived a scalping is shocking, to say the least. But the practice of scalping its origins are rather staggering, and I'll tell you this when we get to discussing it a little more. But it's not a Native American practice. And when you realize this and when you learn this, it becomes even more unbelievable, because it's actually a practice that we as white settlers actually teach the Native Americans. And when I mean teach, you'll be horrified by how we teach Native Americans. We actually teach them out of our own fear of them. And yeah, it's really horrifying to realize that we taught them and they perfected it. And there's some other gruesome practices that they actually adopt that are something that we had been practicing over in Europe for centuries with our enemies. That many of you will go, oh, I did not know that. Yeah, we taught them very well, unfortunately, folks. And anyway, then there were the Mormon settlers in Utah. Now, the church had experienced a complicated and tragic history since its founding in 1830 in Nauvoo, Illinois, under its prophet Joseph Smith Jr. Now, some of you may know the history of the Mormon Church, some of you may not. But the Mormon Church's history is extremely complicated and extremely tragic, and devastating, in fact. I encourage you, if you ever get a chance, to read the book Kingdom of Nauvoo. And it's not so much propaganda or anything about the Mormon Church. I know some people have mixed feelings about the Mormon Church. I'm not advocating, a particular religion here or anything. But this book is a historiography on the church told through the 1830s American history. And it is a fascinating look at how the church fits in as a persecuted minority group. And it is an amazing work of um, study of history of the church, and I would strongly encourage you to read it. I assign it actually for my History 100 class. That's why otherwise I would have signed it for this particular class, but it doesn't fit in with this particular time. But I do encourage you to read it because the events that are talked about in this book are things that we don't talk about. It's one of these silences that goes unexplored in our historical narrative in our country. And we don't realize the events that take place involving the Mormons. And I think it's important that we talk about these things when they're not explored. There's other silences we're going to talk about in this course. One of them that I mentioned in brief in our opening video about that's been taken out of your textbook because of a recent discovery that's come to light bothers me terribly, and we will be talking about that as well, involving Native Americans, is another one of those silences that we will be talking about because of its relevance and its relative importance involving our Native peoples. And I feel that it's crucial that we talk about these silences and not just, pretend they didn't happen because it makes us uncomfortable. And the story of the Mormons is one of those ones that makes people uncomfortable because we don't like to talk about, especially when we have Americans killing other Americans, whether they're African American, whether they're Mormons, whether they're Native Americans. When we talk about what we did with Japanese Americans during World War II, and we put them in a camp because we were supposed to be quote unquote protecting them, when actually we were scared to death that they might be spies, and it turned out they weren't spies. We were just, racists. We had racists in our government that actually did that. We'll get into that when we get to World War II. Yeah, there's all sorts of complicated things that we do, and we don't want to talk about it because it makes us very uncomfortable. We don't like talking about those things when we realize that we've made horrible mistakes in history, and we don't like having to address those uncomfortable things. And this is one of those uncomfortable things, is the story about the Mormons, because yeah, we kind of did some really bad, horrible, awful things, and we murdered. There was some government officials in Missouri that did some pretty awful things to Mormon women and children and men, and we don't want to talk about that because it's really kind of awful and ugly and disgusting what they did. But we don't talk about that because it's ugly. So I encourage you to read The Kingdom of Naboo because it does talk about that and it does tell the story. And there are other silences that we'll talk about. Persecution of Catholics is one that I talk about in History 100. Yeah, so just food for thought there. And moving on to a more cheerful topic is the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific Railroads. This is also an exciting time in our history because we have the unification of our country by the famous Iron Horse. If you've never heard railroads referred to as the Iron Horse, this is when we have this exciting point in time in history of the unification of the country by the two railroads, these two significant railroads at Promontory Summit, or Promontory Point, Utah, on May 10, 1869. Now, we talk about this moment as being very significant for our history because it proves that a transcontinental line can be made. But what we don't talk about is that the cost was very prohibitive. very difficult for the average American to afford. A ticket was $50, and $50 was a lot of money in those days. I mean, for us now, it's like, it's expensive, but it still could be done. Um, you know, the to try to ride the train down to San Diego is about $26 on Amtrak. Um, One way, that is. So you're thinking, yeah, 26, $50. That's not too bad across country, right? Well, to consider that the average house kit, now this was entire house kit, pre-cut wood, everything through Sears Roebuck, about the same time frame, was about $19. That puts you, and that was a two-story house, mind you. That was really fancy house. It was $19. That gives you an idea of how expensive $50 was. $50 was a lot of money. Very expensive for the average person. So you're looking at that and you're going, $50, that's a lot of money. What changed transcontinental railroad travel for us happened approximately 16 years later. 16 years later. And I'm thinking that I should hold a live discussion on what that great moment was with the second transcontinental railroad route. Because the second transcontinental railroad route actually came through our area and dramatically changed transcontinental railroad travel. And actually, what made the second transcontinental railroad line so significant was it dropped the price of a railroad ticket from $50 to $1.50 overnight, which was very affordable for the average American, and actually nearly bankrupted Southern Pacific, which is what Union Pacific became. So I'm thinking that I'm going to have a live discussion on this topic because I want you guys to learn the story. And the second transcontinental line was run by the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe. You probably have heard the name of the Atchison, Topeka, and the Santa Fe. Probably shortened to Santa Fe, because the rail company became very famous. So I'm thinking that, that's what we should have, is a live discussion. And I will post something up on our discussion on the second transcontinental rail line. So be looking for an announcement on that and how the settlement follows the rail lines. This is very common even with the first transcontinental rail line, and very, very consistent with the second transcontinental rail line. We'll be talking about that in the live discussion as well. Something else that's a pattern that occurs with both transcontinental lines is railroad officials will be given the distinction when they contribute to locating town sites that the town sites will be given their names. Case in point is Victorville. Victorville, out here in Southern California, is actually named after a railroad official with the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe by the name of Jacob Nash Victor, who was very significant, played a significant role in getting the two lines to connect, the California Southern line that came up from National City and went through Cajon Pass, and the Atlantic and Pacific line that was actually the spur line from New Mexico that ran from New Mexico to the present day site of Victorville. and the two lines met up at Victorville. So they named the town site where the two lines met in his honor. And of course, Victorville. And it meets up in the Victor Valley, which also bears his name. So, something to think about. And he's actually buried, interestingly enough, because he loved the area here in San Bernardino so very much. He's actually buried here in Mountain View Cemetery. So if you're ever interested to visit his grave, there's a big headstone in Mountain View Cemetery that says Victor on it. That's Jacob Nash Victor's grave. That's where he and his wife Elizabeth are buried. So little railroad history there. And you'll learn when I give my little live discussion why I know so much about railroad history as well. So anyway, mobility for the Army was also aided by the railroad. And we'll be talking about the significance this plays not only in this point in history, but will play subsequently in the future of the United States as well. Now we're going to move on to the origins of Indian reservations. So the U.S. proposed creating separate territory for each tribe and giving them government subsidies. Now the idea was that it would prevent violence between Indians and settlers. Now there was opposition early on to this plan provided by Red Cloud, who fiercely fought this idea for obvious reasons, that the Native Americans had already been stripped away from their native lands, original native lands, and he felt that they would be further forced off their lands. And he actually led warriors against the forces from Fort Phil Kearny in a bloody confrontation where the soldiers were all killed and had their bodies stripped and mutilated. Now, when I talk about stripping and mutilating their bodies, this is when I can tell you a little bit more about some of the strategies that the Native Americans acquired from us. See, scalping and another practice that we will see utilized at the Battle of Little Bighorn was there was scalping, and then there was a mutilation strategy that they used as a form of emasculation with men. And that was that they would cut off a man's penis and stick it into their mouths. Now, when you hear this, you're like, oh my word, that's an awful thing. Well, you realize that this strategy, scalping and this other strategy, were something that they actually had acquired from white settlers, dating back to the earliest days of our colonial era, when we first arrived here as white settlers from England. You see, there was a pamphlet that circulated around called The Red Devil. And it was popularized over in England, that told about these vicious monsters that roamed around this new land. And these creatures were heathens, and they practiced all sorts of sorcery and witchcraft and everything. And they did these things, these mutilations and all sorts of devilment and everything. And they talked about how they took the scalps off their victims, and they butchered their victims with cutting off their genitals and all this. So naturally, by the time that settlers actually got over here to the New World to set up their colonies, they were terrified. They were absolutely worked into a frenzy over the prospect of meeting any potential devils. And when they saw the first Native Americans, these stories had them whipped into a fury at the prospect of meeting a Native American, of what these heathens really were as they saw them, and what practices they had. So you can kind of envision the first interactions between colonists and native peoples not going so well, based on this existence of this narrative of the Red Devil running through these colonists' minds, and breaking down very rapidly of, Native Americans walking around innocently through the forest, running into a white settler who sees them and immediately goes to the instant thought of, there's one of those red devils, they're going to kill me. So an altercation takes place where an innocent Native American gets killed, and that's trying to explain that he's harmless, and obviously there's a breakdown in communication because they don't speak the same language. Things escalate, and before the first blow is made by the Native American, who has obviously no reason to attack the white settler because he can't understand why he got attacked, the white settlers attack the Native Americans, launch a preemptive strike, and they go into the Native American village. They attack the Native Americans in the way that they perceive they're going to be attacked. They scalp the Native Americans. They cut off their genitals. They do exactly what they read in the Red Devil pamphlet that they are going to have done to them. The Native Americans come back to their village, find their people mutilated in this way, and they realize that these white people, these white devils, have attacked their village, mutilated their people, and they see all these horrible barbaric things, and they go, these people are awful. What are they? They're monsters. But then they see these things and they're like, if they're going to do that to us, then we're going to do the same thing back. And that's how the practice of scalping and mutilation begins. And it's carried on and it's practiced and it's repeated each time these interactions take place. So that's how the cycle actually is repeated. And it's kind of startling to realize that it's nothing that is actually a cultural practice that the Native Americans develop. It's something they learn from us. So we have to think about, had we not originally done that to them, how would interactions have been vastly different between us and the Native Americans? Food for thought, folks. So anyway, Red Cloud actually admitted of the actions of the soldiers. When the white man comes in my country, he leaves a trail of blood behind him. So when you think about what I just told you, it fits with what Red Cloud said. That's very true. So when we come to the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, the treaty is actually a continuation, because most of the Native Americans did eventually agree to go onto the reservations, but there were holdouts. And the Fort Laramie Treaty actually was a final agreement by which the remaining Native American tribes who had not signed the Medicine Lodge Treaty would agree to confine themselves to the reservations as long as the United States agreed to abandon forts along the Bozeman Trail. And this was also signed by Red Cloud of the Northern Plains Indians, because Red Cloud had refused to sign the Medicine Lodge Treaty. But this one, the Fort Laramie Treaty, he did agree. It was also one of the last treaties by which the Native Americans were each treated with the respect as being acknowledged as individual nations. After that, starting in 1871, they were regarded and treated as subject peoples and nothing more. So when you think about that, it's a terrible thing that they were no longer regarded as individual tribes, that they were regarded as one people en masse. Then we have George Armstrong Custer. And Custer, of course, was regarded rather harshly by the Native Americans. He had participated in a rather horrible action at the Black Hills prior to the infamous massacre at Little Bighorn on June 26th of 1876. And so his fitting in at Little Bighorn almost seemed like a payback, as karma, so to say. And it depends on how you look at it, whether it was the greatest defeat or the Indians' greatest success. Because Custer goes into the battle at Little Bighorn very confident, in fact, overconfident, that he will be able to go into this essentially bowl of a valley with his men, march straight in, and he believed that he could easily take the Native Americans that were there. What he didn't count on was that his soldiers would be outgunned and outnumbered by the natives that were laying in wait for them. And what happened was, when they entered the valley, they were suddenly surrounded and overwhelmed. And the native peoples overtook them and took them out with firepower that was far superior. Their guns were far superior than the weapons that Custer's men had, and they quickly wiped them out brutally, swiftly, and decisively. So anyway, with that, we'll discuss reforming Native American tribes out of existence. So one of the things that happened with Native Americans was the mass slaughter of buffalo herds. One of the things that, of course, Native Americans were most renowned for was how efficiently they utilized the buffalo out on the plains. Well, when you have the white man coming out onto the plains with the advent of the railroads, with the transcontinental lines, they quickly make short work of the buffalo, whether it's by the slaughtering of them with the railroad workers or the buffalo hunts from trains. They quickly take out huge swaths of the buffalo. And they do not efficiently utilize the buffalo the way the Native Americans did. They waste the buffalo. Often they took only the hides and left the rest of the buffalo to rot in the sun. So you would have massive fields of rotting buffalo carcasses, which was devastating for the native peoples to see, because to them it was truly a waste. They utilized virtually every part of a buffalo, whereas the white man only wanted the buffalo for his hide. The Nez Perce tried to flee to Canada to escape being put on the reservation, which was not a successful endeavor. Then you have the ghost dance religious revival movement. This is actually a way of mourning, of grieving the loss of the culture, a loss of their freedom, a loss of their independence that the natives were essentially mourning um, in response to everything that was happening with the reservation, with the buffalo, and everything. And the government was coming down harshly upon the native tribes that were practicing the ghost dance. They were trying to essentially suppress it. And what happens is the brutal response um, at Wounded Knee, that results in a massacre of predominantly women and children in 1890, um, that calls into question whether it was necessary to act so brutally. But ultimately, it's a vindication on the Army's part of, well, they were ultimately uprising against the government. Well, that wasn't the case. They were defenseless. They were not uprising against the government. They were grieving a way of life that was being slowly taken away, removed from them. And as we will see, it's very true of what we were doing. And we also see that reformers hoped that reservations would encourage Indians to adopt white social values. Reformers are going to use the reservations as a way to try to strip Native Americans of their Native identities. They wanted to, as they so eloquently put it, remove the savage, take the savage out of the, remove the savage from the man, I think is how it was worded. Um, it was a brutal way of clearly stating what the intent was to strip the Native American of their Native identity, stripping away their culture. To this end, we will talk about the Native American boarding schools, and it's the Native American boarding schools that I've been alluding to that I will be talking about in our next few lectures, that have been the center of controversy in recent months. You may have heard about the closure of a boarding school and the excavation that took place around a boarding school in North Dakota, and the staggering discovery of children's skeletons and skeletal remains that was made. And all of a sudden, the absolute dumbfounded, shocked realization that children were killed at that boarding school. It's opened a whole new dialogue on what really transpired in the Indian boarding schools. And it is not surprising for me. We have a boarding school here in Southern California that has long been a mystery. It's the Paris Indian School. I researched it when I was the archivist out in Paris, and we believe that there may have been upwards of 100 children that died at that boarding school. And I made it my duty while I was archivist at Paris that I would try my hardest to see those children located and repatriated to their homes, to their home tribes. We still are actively, I say actively because we only know of where one child is interred. We do not know where the others are, because we can't even technically find the actual exact location of where the school was located. There's been some discrepancies in records. That's how well hidden the school has been, how inaccurate the records are on this school site. But anyway, we will be talking more about the Indian boarding schools and what happened with the Indian boarding schools, and I may even make that a live discussion as well. because it's such a controversy right now, and it's become such a hot button topic. Because for a long time it was, well, the Indian boarding schools, they treated the kids kind of bad, but they only treated the kids bad. They really didn't do anything violent to them. When I've seen the records, I've read the accounts of what they did do to the children, and I knew that what I'd read about the Paris Indian school was accurate, and I knew that the children did die at the school, and we had sufficient evidence to say the children had died at the school, but people were silencing us and saying, you can't say that. The children died without bodies. And people were telling us, no, you can't do that because it'll upset people. And we even had scholars that were saying the same thing to us, that you can't say children died at that school. And now it's come out that yes, children died at these schools. And it's being recognized nationally, and there's a congressional investigation that's ongoing about these Indian boarding schools. And I'm grateful. I'm very grateful, because it's my hope is that those children will be found and repatriated to their homes, even though it's been so long, just to see justice done, to know that over 100 children died and their families never knew what happened to them. It's a hard thing to know that such a terrible crime happened and nobody paid for that crime. It's terrible. It's really terrible. But we'll be talking more about that, so you learn about the Paris Indian School, and you can know the story of these children too. So the Dawes Severalty Act of 1887, it was considered one of the most important pieces of Indian legislation of the 19th century. The reservation land was broken into separate plots and distributed amongst individual families. The goal was to force Indians to live like white farmers, or as one reformer put it later, killing the Indian and saving the man, which is what I was trying to say earlier. The idea was that these little plots, you have this giant piece of land that was the original Indian land. And this huge chunk of the land was saved for the white man. And then this itty bitty piece of land is saved for the natives, the Native Americans. But it's going to be divided up into itty bitty teeny tiny little plots of land for Native Americans who comply with certain requirements to become good white men. And once they meet all the requirements to make the decision to live like good white men, they can have one of these little plots of land. And they can have one of these little plots. And you're probably looking at me, you're going, a little tiny plot out of this really huge chunk of land? And this additional huge chunk of land is reserved for the federal government to sell off to white men? And then these little bitty teeny tiny little plots are for Native Americans who agree to live as white men? Yeah, seems like a lot of inequality there, right? That's the idea, is inequality. The land was generally so poor and plots so small, owners generally sold them. Obviously, there was hardly any way you could farm these plots of land. They were so tiny. The large plots were kept in trusts and gradually sold off. By the early 20th century, only a few diminished reservations remained outside the desert Southwest. Probably the most well-known of these reservations is the Navajo. You may have heard of the Navajo Reservation. Um, some of the Navajos still live in terrible poverty. Some parts of their reservation is still stricken with incredible levels of poverty, um, just staggering levels of poverty. Not all Navajo live in that level of poverty, but there are some. Um, but it's criminal that we still have some of our native peoples that are still um, held in such dire levels of poverty when we have resources that can help them, that we still have resources there that can be provided to them. And yet we don't. And they were here before us. It's criminal. It's truly criminal. The retreat from the Republican radicalism. So we go back and we talk about our friends in the South. The Republicans were becoming the party of moderation. They ran Ulysses S. Grant for president in 1868. And of course, we talked briefly about Ulysses S. Grant as a presidential candidate and as president. I mean, he was a very intriguing person to run for president. He'd had a lackluster career as a military man. I mean, graduating from West Point, the bottom of his class, up until the Civil War, he was stationed out in some outpost in the middle of nowhere. Until the Civil War broke out. Then he rises to prominence during the Civil War and ultimately becomes the general of the day during the Civil War. And this is where he ultimately makes a name for himself, becoming the general of the hour, and makes himself, into this hero. But he has a drinking problem, a huge drinking problem. And he is also notorious for having in his cabinet a bit of a issue with corruption. Restoration rather than radicalism becomes his platform pretty much. There's violence that breaks out across the South in favor of Democrats. We ultimately come to reconstructing the North with the 15th Amendment and nationwide African American suffrage. So we come to this critical point to efforts to end discrimination and segregation in the North. And the 15th Amendment limited grounds on which the vote could be denied. However, it did not guarantee voting rights. It does offer this idea of suffrage. But the critical thing here is it does not deny suffrage based on race, but it does not mention gender. And this is where there's going to be a split between the abolition movement and women's rights. And women's suffrage, because up until this time, abolition and women's suffrage pretty much were hand in hand with moving towards getting suffrage for both women and African Americans. But when the 15th Amendment passes, and there's only mention of race in the language of the 15th Amendment, women are going to feel deeply, the women's suffrage movement is going to feel deeply betrayed. They're going to feel that the African American suffrage movement made the push to get their language into the 15th Amendment without consideration for women. even though women helped them gain suffrage. And the fact of the matter is that wasn't the case. However, this is going to cause a permanent rift between the two movements. And women are told so much as to allow this to be, again, quote unquote, the Negro's hour, and that their time will come. And the staggering thing is, it will take until well after the 20th century before women will secure their right to vote. So whites, as I mentioned, all this of the gender discrimination is going to continue on. So we see the end of Reconstruction coming. We see the development of political machines, which we'll be talking about more in the coming chapters. Corporate control of lawmakers. The scandals will also will discredit Republican rule as well. And liberal Republicans revolt. They challenged these bosses of these political machines that come to power and corporate power in government. They called for lower tariffs, stable currency based on gold, merit-based civil service, universal amnesty for Confederates. And they ultimately wind up nominating Horace Greeley for president, who loses in a landslide. And then we see redeeming the South. And we see the Panic of 1873 led to unemployment and labor unrest. And interest in Reconstruction begins to plummet. Democrats made a comeback in the 1874 elections. So we see again a swing towards Democrats regaining control. We see the slaughterhouse cases and the U.S. versus Cruikshank then taking center stage as well. Now, what are these cases about? Well, the 1873 slaughterhouse cases. A majority decided that the 14th Amendment's protection of equal rights under the law covered only those rights associated with national citizenship. So rights affiliated with state citizenship, for example, the right to butcher cattle when a Louisiana state law gave a monopoly to one particular firm, could only be upheld by the state. And then the 1876 U.S. versus Cruikshank, the court took up a horrific massacre of some 150 black state militiamen at Colfax, Virginia on Easter Sunday, 1873. It decided that the Equal Protection Clause applied only to state government's actions, not that the paramilitary is responsible. So Democrats determined to redeem their states from Republican rule, and this was accomplished through paramilitaries and white leagues. So now we're going to look at an incident at Cochetta in August of 1874. So hard times ultimately led Democrats to organize rifle clubs in the White League. They arrested parish officers in Cochetta, and they ultimately killed them. Now, this wasn't just a few people. This was a significant number. I believe the number was about 50 total. So this is a significant number of people that are essentially being executed. The Democrats effectively prevented Republicans from governing here by doing that. And then we ultimately come to the twice stolen election of 1876. Now, Samuel J. Tilden won the popular vote, but with white violence in the South, there's this tension rising. There's a fear that, this election is going to carry more weight than is realized. Rutherford B. Hayes won the Electoral College, however. Now, Hayes agrees to end Reconstruction, and we come up to the presidential election of 1876. And there's 3 holdout states. And one of them happens to be Florida. Now, there's a backdoor deal that is cut, that Hayes will become the president as long as the agreement is made that, whatever happens in Washington, we will abide by whatever happens in Washington, as long as whatever happens down in the South is ignored by those in Washington. So Hayes reluctantly, sort of reluctantly agrees to this so that he can become president. The powers that be agree, all right, whatever you want, we will accept as long as you give us the votes for Florida. Then, we'll call it a deal, that will throw the election in the favor of Hayes. It makes it essentially a deal with the devil. And ultimately, this deal has long-standing ramifications for our country. You can call this bargain of 1877 essentially the setting the stage for the eventual establishment of Jim Crow in the Deep South, because Washington turns a blind eye to what ugliness will happen down in the South when this bargain of 1877 passes. We've already, with redeeming the South, with everything that's gone on prior to this election, started to turn that blind eye, and with this, we ultimately take the final step away from wishing to do anything to shut down anything negative that's going on down there regarding racial relations, segregation, anything. So, and any efforts to keep African Americans away from the polls. So anyway, with that, we have one more thing to cover, which is sharecropping becoming wage labor. So Northern investment made expansion of infrastructure industry possible in the South. We see expanded cotton production. Redeemer governments define sharecroppers as wage laborers, not owners of crops. Landlords benefited. Sharecropping system bound the region to the cotton economy, which remained dependent on northern capital and goods. And ultimately, this cotton market remained highly volatile. As we'll see, this is not necessarily a good way for the economy to stay focused is on the cotton industry, and we will see the reason why moving forward. So with that, we've reached the end of chapter 15. I hope you've enjoyed this first 3-part lecture. I promise you the next lectures hopefully will not be as long. But as you can see, I get involved in lecturing and I enjoy the subject, and I hope that you will gain as much as I do from lecturing as listening to them. So with that, we will move on to the next chapter. Enjoy. Have a good night.